Hello, and welcome to Your Health Matters. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Hogenkamp. Today, with flu season nigh upon us, it's not quite here, but it's nigh upon us, I thought the time would be right to discuss flu vaccination and to extend that discussion into the idea of, should I be vaccinated? Should my child be vaccinated? The whole topic of vaccinations in general. And I wanted to frame that discussion by starting off with this common sense idea, this straightforward perspective that getting a vaccine to prevent an illness is a whole lot better than actually suffering through the illness itself. But one of the things I've learned in 25 years of practicing medicine is that not everyone shares that perspective. And that's an idea that is enforced in my mind every day when I go to work when people turn down vaccines. So I thought I'd come around and look at it from the other way around, not the straightforward common sense perspective, but the actual science of the issue. What do the numbers say? What do the doctors tell us? What do the studies say? And to do that, I've asked my friend and colleague, pediatrician Dr. Stephen Wood, to come help me. Steve, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter. So
let's start off by talking about the flu, since it's late November and the flu is going to be here quickly. Tell me about the flu. How common is it? How severe is it? Let's get started with that.
The flu is a complicated virus and one of the more harmful diseases out there. The vaccine is quite effective, and I very much promote vaccination for the flu.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. Otherwise, you would have been a poor choice as a guy. So how common is the flu? I mean, how often do people get it?
It's going to be in the United States about 12% likelihood of encountering the flu and getting it.
So each year, about 12 people out of 100 will end up getting the flu.
Roughly.
Roughly.
Yeah.
And that will depend every year upon the different strains of the flu and that kind of thing.
Right.
Alrighty. And how severe will their symptoms be? I suppose that varies a lot too as well.
Totally. Many times the flu is just going to be not a whole lot more than a mild cold, but sometimes it can be the cause for pneumonia and hospitalization and even death. There was some statistics from the CDC that showed vaccination preventing about 7 million cases of flu a year, and probably about 8,000 deaths.
8,000 deaths
annually
a year prevented
in the United States.
You make that point, and I try to. My patients say to me, "Geez, doc, I don't want the flu vaccine." I'm like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, well, what could happen to me? I have a fever and chills, and I always tell them the story about the Spanish flu of 1918, which killed 50 million people worldwide. I mean, the flu can be a severe illness. And it does vary some year in terms of with the different strains, isn't that right?
Very much so, and that's the problem with the vaccination scenario. Is we have to be revaccinated every year because this is a very tricky virus that's always mutating
yeah.
And it's changing its
the proteins on the surface.
Yes, it's antigenicity, I think it's called.
Right. Yeah.
And so every year it has to be reformulated, and so we're hoping that this is looking like a good fit, but we sometimes don't know until a little bit later.
So this year, because the last couple of years it's been pretty disappointing, hasn't it?
Yeah, but still around 40 to 60% efficacy.
So tell me what that actually means.
Efficacy. So.
A lot of people think I get the flu shot, I'm never going to get the flu.
Right.
But we obviously can't guarantee that.
Right. There's no. It's not a bulletproof vest by any stretch.
Right.
But it does reduce your severity of illness to a very clearly. But it also reduces your risk of mortality. It turns out.
Right.
I think children that I'm keenly concerned about as a pediatrician. The risk is very much reduced of actually death.
So the complications that you might get from the flu, those come quite a bit down with the flu, even if you're going to actually get the illness itself.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And that's what we're really trying to do as health people, as purveyors of health. We're trying to prevent those complications kind of thing. Because if somebody's going to get a minor illness, that's one thing. But if somebody's going to be hospitalized with meningitis or pneumonia, that's a different thing as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm always interested in the efficacy of the flu vaccine because, of course, I get it every year, the flu vaccine. And, people are coughing in my face all year long, as you know that, especially during flu season. And I want to think in the back of my head, oh, I'm okay here because I've had that flu vaccine. There's the flu is kind of an interesting illness because it's one of the few illnesses that actually kind of goes back and forth between animals and people. People talk about the swine flu kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
It's called the swine flu because it actually started in pigs. And then was people that work with pigs kind of get it from that, and then it spread to people. So tell me about how they make the flu vaccine and how they predict which flu strain is going to hit us.
So that's very complicated and
inexact.
Yeah. This year the flu vaccine is a quadrivalent.
So there's 4 strains.
There's 4 strains.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of prediction from last year's strain and the prediction of what this strain is going to look like. And there's 4 of them. 2 of them are type A, and 2 of them are type B this year. So there used to be a pediatric version that was live and intranasal, and that had a lot of ease to it because there was no needle attached.
Right, the kids loved it.
The kids loved it, but the statistics did not show that it really performed well at all.
Right, so they've taken that off.
That was a big disappointment.
Yeah.
So previously, flu was grown in egg-based medium.
Yeah.
And now that's been changed, and so the risk of actually egg allergy is much reduced.
Oh, that's great.
It's really not a big deal.
Right.
But it's a huge manufacturing process, and so I think this year's strains are.
So they have to predict it well in advance.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons where error might come up because they have to do it probably 6 months in advance. They have to basically guess as to what vaccines are going to circulate around the world and come to us.
Correct.
It's an educated guess.
Yeah.
So you said something that kind of keyed off a question for me, and that is you were talking about egg allergies. I know that's one of the reasons people sometimes will say, well, I can't have the vaccine. Are there any contraindications to the flu vaccine? Are there any people you'd say, I don't really want you to have the flu vaccine, or do you think everyone should have it?
I think there are some contraindications if they've had a prior allergic response to the flu vaccine. But other than that, I'm not aware of any distinct contraindications. So pretty much, it's really recommended for every child and adult who's over 6 months of age.
Right, over 6 months of age.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So one of the things you were talking about with this previous history of an allergy to a flu vaccine, that's where it gets a little tricky for me, because I'll say to a person, I'd like you to get the flu vaccine. I had a reaction. And so, well, what was your reaction? Well, last year I got the flu vaccine. I ended up getting 4 colds that winter. And to this person's mind, they really feel like that was the flu vaccine that did that. The way I look at it is, well, they didn't get the flu. So the flu vaccine was actually effective.
Right.
The fact that they got a couple of upper respiratory infections, that have nothing to do with the flu, doesn't really make any difference to me.
Correct.
But they feel like it's a reaction to the flu, and that's one of the things that I fight against all the time.
Yeah, we're giving the flu vaccine during the winter season, where we are we're being exposed to so many winter seasonal illnesses, and so your statistical risk of being exposed to a cold when you leave Dr. Hogenkamp's office or my office, is definitely there. So the vaccine is not live, so you will not get an illness from the shot.
You cannot get an illness from the shot.
You can't.
It's not. It's a purified protein.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Some feel a little discomfort, and that may linger a little while. but you will not get sick from the flu shot.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good kind of segue into talking about vaccines in general. And you were talking about live vaccines, and I was talking about a purified protein. So explain to us some of the different types of vaccines that you guys use, that we use, to prevent illness.
So there's quite a bit.
So there are live vaccines.
Yes.
There are live vaccines.
Yes.
And the whole idea with these live vaccines is that they're attenuated, which
Right.
means that they won't cause illness or won't cause severe illness.
And that would be like the MMR, the measles, mumps, and rubella, and
Right.
the chickenpox.
Right.
And then also for pediatrics is the rotavirus, which is actually a drinkable
Right.
vaccine that you give at the 2 and 4 month visit.
It's the shot that isn't a shot.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Or the
yes.
vaccine that isn't a shot.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the whole idea with live vaccines, obviously they're considered safe because these things are studied by the CDC, but they're live, but attenuated, meaning that the body will form an antibody response against them and prevent you from getting the illness, but they won't cause you to have any symptoms.
Correct. Correct. And they tend to actually give a very robust immune response. I mean, the statistics of measles is just incredible. You know, we had 400,000 cases of measles annually in the United States prior to vaccinations.
Which, like in the 60s or?
Right, in the 50s and 60s.
Right, yeah.
Just an amazing, I mean, and this was a really, really severe illness. I've never seen a case of measles.
Neither have I.
but this was a terrible illness. And now we see about 1,200 a year. And this is actually a great upsurge, recently because of pockets of under-immunization.
Like what happened out in California.
Yep.
And I think there was a case in Brooklyn, a little flare up in Brooklyn.
Montreal recently.
In Montreal.
Yep.
That's right. And that brings up an interesting point. And I have people in my practice that choose to not vaccinate. And I discuss it with them. I tell them we're very pro-vaccine practice, and I'm very proud to say that. But some people choose not to vaccinate, and what they tell me is, well, everybody else gets vaccinated, so my kid doesn't need the vaccine. And unfortunately, when enough people do that, you kind of get this critical mass, which allows for all of a sudden one person gets the disease, it can really spread.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. When you're getting vaccinated, you're helping yourself, but you're also helping the community.
Helping the community.
And there are a number of people who may not be able to get the vaccine. They're
Right.
too young.
Right.
Kids who are just, for instance, measles. You won't get it until you're 1 year of age,
right?
Or 4. It's boosted at 4 years of age. So if you're under 1, you haven't gotten it. So to get the measles vaccine is protecting yourself, but also the little kids, those that may be in treatment who have immune systems that are a little bit deficient.
Or they have cancer and they're on chemotherapy,
exactly.
That kind of thing. So you're not only doing something for your own child, but for the community as well.
Right.
Kind of thing. I hear a lot about people who feel like there are significant negatives to childhood vaccine. And the one thing that always comes to my mind would be the idea that vaccines can cause autism. And this, I explain to my patients all the time, this has been extensively studied by the CDC, and there's no link.
Yeah, this was a terrible moment in the history of vaccines. In 1989, a British physician, Andrew Wakefield, came out and wrote a paper in The Lancet that has been since totally debunked, and it was shown to be really a fraud, basically, who tried to show that MMR, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, somehow there was a correlation with autism, and this is completely fallacious. And there was the science was dissolved when it was looked at carefully, and there was actually some egregious links with lawyers who were profiting from the situation that were also revealed. So he was since defrocked, Dr. Wakefield.
I like that word, defrocked.
Yes.
I hope it doesn't happen to me.
I know. But unfortunately, it got
into the general public.
It just went into It ignited a frenzy, and it's still, so while it's been shown clearly to be a lie, nevertheless, it was dispensed into the public, and this is something that we're still trying to rewind.
We're trying to rewind it.
Yeah.
And what I tell patients is that there are now enough people who refuse the MMR vaccine to create a significant population. And we can study that population and the incidence of autism in that population with the incidence of autism in the population of people who've been vaccinated, the bulk of people. And when the CDC has looked at this, there's no difference.
Right.
There's no difference in how likely your kid is to develop autism if he or she gets the vaccine or not.
Right.
And that's been extensively studied by the CDC. And I tell people this. Unfortunately, sometimes they're less likely to believe me. And again, I've spent my whole life doing this. And yourself, they're more likely to believe their hairdresser or some personality on TV kind of thing. Right. And that's a shame kind of thing. Let's talk about the chickenpox vaccine for a little while. Chickenpox is a disease that I have seen. And not only have I seen it, I've actually gotten it.
Yes.
Because when you and I were born, there was no vaccine. In fact, I remember my mother telling me that people used to get chickenpox parties. That's how I got chickenpox. One of her girlfriends, a kid, had chickenpox, so off we went, and I played with his toys, and lo and behold, I ended up with chickenpox. So when people tell me stories like that, when I hear stories like that, people say, okay, well, what's the problem with that? What is so bad about getting chickenpox?
Most of the time, chickenpox, I have actually seen chickenpox as well, and I had the live chickenpox like you. So for the most part, it's generally benign. Right. It's a pain in the neck. Parents, have to stay with their children, and the children's not going to go to school until the lesion has scabbed over and dried up, and so they're not contagious anymore. But it was, we had 4 million cases of chickenpox annually prior to the vaccine. Right. So it was a big economic impact. Right. But it also, that's right. If you were on the wrong side of the statistic, there were mortality to chickenpox. Right. If you had immunodeficiencies. So we had
100 deaths a year.
100 plus or so annually. So the chickenpox is a pain in the neck, and for those that are immunologically vulnerable, it can be deadly. Mm-hmm. So it is now required for schools to be vaccinated against but it's also, so you protect yourself against chickenpox, so you're also protecting yourself against the chronic manifestation, which is shingles. So there's a reduction in shingles risk as well.
There's a significant, and as a family doctor, I take care of both kids and adults. I talk about shingles all the time because it's one of the most feared diseases out there. And what I tell people is that the kids who got the vaccine are much less likely to get shingles, which is in a sense a reactivation of the chickenpox virus than those people like me and you that had that got our immunity naturally. Right. And I in fact have had the shingles, and it was no day at the beach. But I want to get back to the word you used before, and that was economic. And this is an important consideration in our society. It kind of speaks to our discussion on the flu as well. People, if there are how many cases of the chickenpox? 4 million a year, you said?
Prior to vaccinations, yeah.
Think of how much work there is lost. Yeah. How many people have to stay home from work, the lack of productivity about, taking care of your child while they have the chickenpox. That's an economic issue as well. And obviously, we're more focused on the health issues, and that is the 100 kids a year that die of the chickenpox. And then there are kids that get the chickenpox that don't die, but get significant complications. Like, is it encephalitis that occurs? Right. Yep. And so there are other complications from the chickenpox that way. I want to just shift a little right now and talk about vaccines and cancer. And of course, the vaccine I'm referring to is the human papillomavirus. So tell me about the human papillomavirus, which is a relatively new vaccine.
Yeah, it is. Initially first aimed at girls, and now made appropriately. It's both parts of the equation, correct, which is so boys and girls, starting from age 9 to 11. But typically it's given at 11. So human papillomavirus is a sexually acquired virus. It's a wart type virus, And it turns out this virus can be a cause. It really causes mutations in the host, which is really the basis for cancer of all kinds. It's really the cause, pretty much, of cervical cancer.
It's the cause of cervical cancer.
It's the cause of cervical cancer. And then a myriad of other cancers.
Including oral cancer.
Oral cancer,
right.
Penile cancer, anal
right.
cancer.
Right.
Yep.
So not only what we consider cancer of the genitals, but also cancer of the oral tract as well.
Absolutely.
And just to be clear, so when we say you're saying human papillomavirus, I use that term so infrequently. We call it the HPV vaccine.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And now goes to boys as well.
Correct. It's 2 doses.
2 doses.
2 doses if you're less
3.
than 15.
Right.
Yep. And it's very simple. We try to bundle it with the other required vaccines, which is the Tdap and the meningitis. So we just kind of try to include it in that triad there. Yeah, it's been a huge success of reducing the burden. I think it's like there's been a 71% drop in HPV virus lesions on girls, which is the basis for these cancers.
Right.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
So I think the estimation that there annually is a decrease of about 30,000 cervical cancers yearly.
And think of the savings, going back to the economics of this, think of the savings, because people say to me, geez, doc, vaccines are expensive, and they are. Think of the savings of 30,000 people that don't need a cervical operation, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to point out with the HPV, it's a good example of one virus of which there are many different strains. So a couple hundred strains of HPV virus, but when we vaccinate, we don't actually give you, the vaccine isn't effective against all those different strains. We select a few.
Correct, yeah. And I think in our HPV vaccine, about 6 of them that we're vaccinating are oncogenic, which means that they can cause mutations that lead to the cancer. So, yeah, and they've been adding to that. It's kind of like Windows, 8.0. So every few years we're getting a new entourage that's attached. So,
and we do the same thing with the pneumonia vaccine. So I wanted to focus a little bit on some of the newer vaccines out there. So now we do a vaccine for kids called pneumococcal vaccine. And the pneumococcal vaccine is a little bit different because now we're talking about a vaccine that's effective against bacterial illnesses as opposed to viral illnesses.
Right.
And they're a little bit different.
Correct. Yeah, the pneumococcus is a terrible bacterial infection that causes sepsis or blood infection, meningitis. Pneumonias, ear infections. So
yeah, it's a big player.
Big player, both for kids, but also for
adults.
Geriatric, and it's the.
Are you calling me a geriatric guy?
Because your practice includes the geriatrics. Yeah, that really has changed the landscape tremendously for childhood health. Having the pneumococcus bacteria shielded against.
Absolutely.
Or reduced.
Big reduction in pneumonias and ear infections. And I tell people that I'm putting myself out of business by all these vaccines because we used to see a lot more pneumonias and ear infections than we do now, which is obviously a great thing. And that's what we're there to do.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about the in terms of making the vaccine. It's a little bit different when you make a vaccine against a bacteria versus a virus.
Yeah. That's very true, and I hesitate to open my mouth much wider because I think I'd be stumbling on the science.
One of the things I wanted to talk about was just, we make these conjugated vaccines.
Yes.
Because when you make a vaccine against a bacteria, which is a completely different species or organism than a virus, you're making it against the coat of the bacteria, which is a polysaccharide. And we don't form good immunity against polysaccharides. So these smart researchers then link that to a protein, and we make great antibodies against the protein.
Right.
But what it does is This process of conjugation does two bad things. Well, number one is it increases the price tremendously. The adult pneumonia vaccine that we use, what we call the Prevnar 13, we actually give the same one to kids. We just call it something different. That vaccine's $250, which is very expensive. And it's this process of conjugation that creates the expense. The other thing it does is there are many, many species of pneumonia, of pneumococcus. Because this process takes up a lot of volume, we have to select just 2 or 3 players, or we have to select a limited number of players. In the case of pneumococcal, it's 13 strains of pneumococcus vaccine. But there are hundreds that cause disease. So that kind of limits us in the amount of, how widespread we can be in vaccinating against these things.
Right.
So do you have any stories for me or any anecdotes that you want to tell me about vaccines, or any particular vaccine that kind of strikes your fancy?
I'm just now recalling from my training 2 children with meningitis, which were just terrible. It's just a terrible illness.
Yeah.
So that's the meningococcus vaccine that we give at 11 and 16. And so these were kids. Unfortunately, this is a disease that can look a lot like the flu initially.
A lot like the flu.
Just
occur in the same season?
Oftentimes.
Yep.
And it's oftentimes lethal, and you get septic.
The mortality rate of meningococcus is pretty high.
Very, very high.
Yeah.
These were kids that lost limbs,
Right.
that needed full critical care support with oxygenation and intubation.
And you'll never forget them, will you?
Oh yeah, just terrible. I mean, both of them on the brink of death for probably 2 weeks or so. Needed multiple amputations for their survival, and they were not of age to get the vaccine, but that risk could have been reduced with more around them, more herd immunity that actually had seen that vaccine.
Yeah.
That's near and dear to my heart.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think without being overly morbid, I think we have to remind people that the people can die from these illnesses, and that what we're really doing is preventing death in some circumstances. Some of these children who were vaccinated would have succumbed to these illnesses.
Yeah.
And I like to remind people of that in this day and age where we just don't see these things anymore.
Right.
Kind of thing. I have a similar tale. My cousin and my best friend at the time died of meningococcus.
Wow.
We were both 16. This was many years ago. It was a couple of years ago. But he died of the meningococcal within 12 hours. He went from a tennis match to dead. And he was a wonderful, wonderful kid, and he would have been alive with that vaccine. So the meningococcus is a vaccine that I strongly recommend. And now we actually have a new vaccine, or relatively new, that protects against meningitis B as well.
Correct, yeah. And the science is being hammered out a little bit more on that vaccine, and there's some ambivalence about how long the antibodies last.
Yeah.
And so it hasn't gotten quite the enthusiasm that the standard meningitis vaccine has had, but we still have it available in our practice. And it's especially helpful for those that may have armor that's missing immunologically,
right.
that they need a little extra support, whether they have spleen problems or what have you. Yeah.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that we're giving them at a time that we've actually chosen, and that is before they go to college,
right.
Because these are the types of situations kids cluster together in dormitories and things like that, who are at higher risk, kind of thing. Well, I want to thank Steve. That was wonderful. I really appreciate the discussion. Thank you for tuning in or listening in on the podcast. Again, the website is peter@peterhogenkamp.com. Give me a text, give me an email, let me know of any subjects you want to hear about. And thank you very much for your viewing and listening. I appreciate it. Cheers.